Podcast number 3, Principles of Design. Principles of design are concepts used to arrange the structural elements of a composition. The way in which these principles are applied affects the expressive content or the message of the work. Repetition. Repetition is repeating some aspect or element of the design throughout the entire document. Repetition acts as a visual key that ties your piece together. It controls the reader's eye and helps keep their attention on the piece. Repetition works with patterns to make a composition seem active. Repeating design elements and consistent use of type and graphic styles within a composition helps the viewer navigate through the piece. It also helps unify and strengthen by tying together separate parts. The repetitive elements could be a bold font, a thick line, a certain bullet, color, design element, particular format, or spatial relationship. It can be anything that a reader will visually recognize. Keep in mind, though, that it's important not to repeat so much that it becomes annoying or overwhelming. For example, too much accent in your clothing loses the idea of an accent and becomes the style itself. Proportion and scale. Proportion and scale refer to the relative size and scale of the various elements in a design, the relationship between the objects or parts of a whole. Our most universal standard of measurement is the human body. We judge the appropriate size of objects by that measure. Architectural spaces intended to impress are usually scaled to a size that dwarfs the human viewer. In contrast, the proportions of a private home are usually more in scale with the human measure, and as a result, appear more friendly, comfortable, and less intimidating. Artists often take liberties with natural proportions to achieve their expressive goal. Unusual or unexpected scale can be used as an attention getter within a piece. Balance. Balance is the distribution of heavy and light elements on a page. The weight of an element is the result of size, shape, and tone. Large elements look heavier than smaller elements. In the case of tone, if the smaller element is heavy, it looks heavier than the large elements. Irregular shapes bear greater weight than regular. Balance exists when the elements are placed with a sense of equality or counterbalance. In other words, the weight of the elements counteract so that they seem settled where they're placed. Symmetrical or formal balance. Symmetrical balance occurs when the weight of a composition is evenly distributed around a central vertical or horizontal axis. Under normal circumstances, it exists when there are identical elements or forms on both sides of the axis. A symmetrical balance creates a secure, safe feeling and a sense of solidity. Asymmetrical or informal balance. Asymmetrical balance occurs when the weight of a composition is not evenly distributed around a central axis. Under normal circumstances, it exists when both sides of the central axis are not identical. Often, there is one dominant form that is offset by many smaller forms. Asymmetrical compositions tend to have a greater sense of visual tension. Emphasis. Emphasis is the stressing of a particular area of focus, rather than the presentation of a maze of details of equal importance. When a composition has no focus, nothing stands out. However, the effective use of emphasis can call attention to important areas of the piece, which causes the viewer's eye to return again and again. One way of achieving emphasis is by creating a center of interest, or focal point. A focal point is the area where the eye tends to go first. The focal point is created by making one element dominant, or most important visually, with all the other areas contributing but subordinate. It may be the largest, brightest, darkest, or most complex part of the whole. No more than one component should be used for primary attention. When several components get equal billing, in that they're all the same weight visually, the emphasis is canceled out. Other ways to create emphasis is by contrasting the primary element with its subordinates, or by a sudden change in direction, size, shape, texture, color, tone, or line. Unity and variety. Unity is the wholeness of a composition, the feeling that all the elements belong together. A work of art does not have a beginning and an end. Instead, its parts work together, creating one total picture, a seamless composition. The viewer needs to be aware of the total creation before looking at the parts. There are 3 ways of obtaining unity. First, put objects close to one another in the composition. When objects are placed close together, the viewer's eye is forced to move from one object to the next, inevitably taking in the entire composition, almost as if they are reading a sentence. 2. Make things similar. Using similar textures, colors, or shapes tends to visually connect the parts of a composition. 3. Direct vision by a line, actual or implied, that travels around the composition. This line can be a true line, such as the edge of a road or buildings in an urban landscape, or it can be a suggested line where the eye moves from object to object depending on placement. Variety pertains to the differences and diversity. It is what makes a work of art interesting. Variety can be achieved in a number of ways. An artist can vary textures, color, shapes, and alter their contrast, tone, and intensity to create an exciting composition. Too much unity can be boring. However, too much variety can look chaotic. It's important to find the right balance to have a successful, effective design. Figure and ground. The eye differentiates an object from its surrounding area. A form, silhouette, or shape is naturally perceived as figure. It's the part of a composition that we pay attention to, the design itself. The figure is also called a positive shape. In compositions without recognizable subject matter, what we see as figure will depend on the abstract relationships between the visual elements. The surrounding area around the figure is the ground. It's the negative space of a composition. Balancing figure and ground can make the perceived image more clear. Using unusual figure and ground relationships can add interest and subtlety to an image. The classic face-vase illusion forces the viewer to shift from one figure to the other, but not to see both as figure at the same time. When you see the faces as figure, the vase is the ground. When you see the vase as figure, the faces are the ground. The figure and ground relationship is so important that an artist must consider all of the composition when designing. It is a mistake to only plan the figure. The entire area of the format must be given careful consideration, or the image will be only partially designed. Rhythm. Rhythm is the continuity, recurrence, or organized movement in space and time. Rhythm is achieved through the orderly repetition of any element, line, shape, tone, texture. The eyes will spot the rhythm and follow its pattern. Successful designs have an effective flow. Rhythm helps move the viewer's eye through a layout, directly or subtly. Rhythm can occur in 3 ways. First, when the intervals between the elements, and often the elements themselves, are similar in size or length. Second, with a more organic or flowing sense of movement. Or third, with a sequence of shapes through a progression of steps. Rhythm can help deliver the message by controlling the viewer's eye movement. It can also add life and interaction to an otherwise inanimate page layout. Contrast. Contrast in art and design occurs when two related elements are different. The greater the difference, the greater the contrast. Contrast can draw the viewer's eye into the piece and help guide the viewer through it. Contrast adds visual interest. Most designs require a certain amount of contrast. Too much similarity of the components in any design becomes monotonous and boring. On the other hand, too much contrast can be confusing. The key to working with contrast is to make sure the differences are obvious. The most common ways of creating contrast are by creating differences in size, value, color, type, texture, shape, alignment, direction, and movement. In this illustration, notice the contrast of the light background and the dark foreground, and the contrast of the dark shadows on the teapot and the cup against the wall. There is also a contrast of thick and thin lines in the napkin, straight and curved lines. In this example, the various typefaces create the contrast. The differences between the thick, bold font and the thin, italic, and script fonts. These elements and principles of design are the building blocks used to create a work of art. The principles of design govern the relationships of the elements used and organize the composition as a whole. Successful design incorporates the use of the principles and elements to serve the designer's purpose and visual goals.